All right. Well, first of all, I want to say that we are recording this as well. Given the fact that 3 times as many people signed up actually as are here, which is normal, of course, with these kinds of Zoom events, we decided to record this, and those people are able to ask us for the recording and see it back. But I want to start with thanking everyone for being here and for attending this and giving away their free evening and their evening of maybe following the elections or doing anything else fun, and being here with us and maybe learning a bit more about the choices they're gonna make going forward. I want to start with a little bit about ourselves. So we are O20. We are a new student party at the UVA. But what makes us a bit different than a normal student party is that besides doing our regular work in the university councils, where we have our own candidates and that are trying to get policy change happening, we also organize a lot of events. And one of them is Project Major. So that is where you are right now. So we think that the university could do, well, most honestly, a better job at informing you as students in making a more precise and more accurate choice in what to pick as a specialization. So that is why we invited a student and a professional in every field, in psychology and in other studies, to speak to you, to tell them their experiences, both in their professional field and during their time doing this specialization. And you can also ask your own questions to them. And we hope that in that way, you are able to make a more informed choice. I would like to now give the word to Noor, who is gonna host today. And if there's any more questions about O20 specific, you can always reach out to us, as it says on our website or email or Instagram or whatever. So that being said, thank you guys for being here. And Noor, back to you.
Thank you, Dede. Hi, my name is Noor and I'll be the moderator for today. So before we begin, I'd like to just briefly outline how tonight's going to go. So we're going to start with a student speaker, Lotte, for about 25 minutes, and she'll talk to you about her experience in specialization, followed by a 10-minute Q&A, where you'll be able to ask any questions. So if you have any questions while Lotte is speaking, please write them into the chat, and then I'll ask them. We will then have a short 5-minute break, after which I will introduce to you our professional speaker, Dr. Penelope Cruz, and we will have a moderated discussion over developmental psychology for about 30 minutes, again, followed by a Q&A of 20 minutes. So again, while she's speaking, if you would like to put some questions in the chat. And yeah, without further ado, Lotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Do you hear me loud and clear? Great. Okay. I'm Lotte. I'll start today with doing that bachelor's. For me, that's quite a while ago. I will tell you a little bit more about how long ago it is in a bit. But before we start and before you start asking different questions in the chat, I would like to bombard the chat a little bit, because I think now that you're here and you're still not sure about clinical developmental psychology, you might also consider clinical psychology or maybe a different specialization. And just for my understanding, I would like you to type in the chat what your other options are currently, just so I have a feeling of you guys. So I see a lot of clinical, some social as well. For the brain and cognition person, I might be able to answer a question or two about the difference between the two. Yeah, okay, I thought so. So there's a lot of clinical people, and I also see a few brain and cognition and social ones. That seems to be the trend. Thank you. So that was a short start. Then I'll tell you what I have done. Because back in the day when I did my studies, I'm currently 27, so it has been a little while since I have graduated. I had 2 years of a normal bachelor's, and in my 3rd year, I could specialize. And to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm very much a brain nerd. So I loved brain and cognition in the 1st year and thought, okay, I would really like to know more about the brain and how things work, but I don't want to be a researcher. So I decided, okay, I see myself being a clinical developmental psychologist later on, but I'll start with brain and cognition then, so I can do clinical developmental later on. And so actually what I did was do year 1 and 2, then I did the bachelor brain and cognition, and then I did the bachelor's clinical development. And later on, I did training and development as a master, thinking that I would do the clinical developmental master as well. But in the end, I didn't. And I am currently more of a freelance trainer, next to the fact that I'm also a UVA tutor in the 1st and 2nd year tutorials. So yeah, that's more or less about me. If you have more questions about me later on, feel free to ask. But I'll keep my part short so that you have most time for questions. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my motivation to start developmental psychology, because I think a lot of you will have started psychology with the idea of I am looking forward to helping people, and it's my passion to actually improve people's lives. Well, I had the same, but I saw myself doing the thing on the right side of things. I saw myself sitting in front of cute kids who would tell me their problems and I would help them. And in the end, making their lives easier and better. So that was more or less my motivation to start clinical developmental and also to start to study psychology in general. So I had known that I wanted to do clinical development quite soon in my studies. And when I did, these were the courses. I decided to keep it in Dutch because it's not of much use to any of you that speak English anyway, but it's more to give you a sense of what the bachelor's looks like for me. Because it's not only the courses that you'll do, but also the way the courses are conducted. And yeah, just out of curiosity, there's a few people who have their video on. Thanks for that, by the way. Everyone who can put their video on, please do, so I know who I'm talking to. And also because for the next question, I want you to raise your hand if you do feel like this applies to you. Do you expect more of a practical nature in the courses that you'll do for your specialization than you did for your 1st year? If yes, raise your hand. So if you think that the courses are more practical in nature. Okay, so not everyone. That's interesting. I certainly had that feeling beforehand. And in the end, it is more practical, but I'll show you a little bit about how it looked for me. So there's still a lot of courses. Everything that's colored currently has an exam to test you on and your knowledge. So all for things in the 1st semester actually looked like an exam type of course quite a bit. And in the 2nd semester, it became a little bit different because then there was 2 exam type courses and there was one with an open book. But apart from that, you had your thesis to write and you had clinical, how do you say that? So therapy skills. And these 2 were the only ones not examined. Everything else was just an exam at the end of the course, next to the fact that they also had practical sides to it. Because everything that I noted in light greenish is where you also had a lot of practical type of assignments in your, so you would not only have the exam that counted towards your grade, but also smaller, more practical types of assessments that counted for like 20, 30, or 40% of your grade. The thesis obviously is a different type of thing. That's I made it blue because it was more research based, and everything in fully green was very much focused on what you'll do in the clinical field later on. In this one, you get into testing, and in this one, you get into the clinical ability to talk to another person, or in this case, probably a child or an older person. Now, in your time, so in the current courses, it looks like this, and that's a little bit different than what I had, because I only had 1 year of a specialization and you'll have a year and a half. So I'm sure that since you're considering this course and doing clinical development as your specialization, you already looked into the different types of courses that you'll do. So you'll still do a big thesis and you'll still have a lot of courses about normal development and a few about non-normal development. But next to that, you also have things that I haven't had, like the choice in subjects for the electives. So I can tell you a lot about that. If you have questions, you can, of course, always try to ask me, but I might not know. Is it clear so far? Okay, great. Then I was asked what type of thesis I had written, and I can tell you that I had to look that up. So I wrote it about de overeenkomsten tussen de ontwikkeling van theory of mind en de ontwikkeling van sociale motivatie bij een autisme spectrumstoornis. And in English, that's the similarities between development of theory of mind and social motivation within ASS. So ASD in English. And the social motivation theory was a different type of theory that you don't hear that much about in the current courses within developmental psychology, but it is one of the things that tries to explain why autism occurs and why that development is so different. So what I did, I looked at the development of theory of mind and the research is done there and the different researches in the social motivation theory course. And I looked at the different brain regions because I'm a brain nerd, as I said, and then compared the two. So in the end, that was really cool. I think doing your bachelor thesis is the nicest thesis that you'll do, because in the master's, it feels like so much depends on it. And in the bachelor's, it's actually one of the things that where you can finally show that you have done a lot of RWST assignments and show your skills. Now, in the courses, as I said, I expected, and some of you too, that you would do a lot of practical stuff. But in the end, of course, you get a lot of theory as well. And what I noticed, and when I looked back at my courses from back in the day, I noticed that instead of reading loads of books you would do in the first year, in this clinical developmental specialization, you get a lot of articles that are very recent. You get a lot of tutorial-based classes, which is like there's always lectures, but there's also a lot of emphasis on the tutorials because you do a lot of practical knowledge based on videos. So you don't get to interact with kids that much yet, in my experience, but you watch a lot of videos and see how kids develop in a normal type of development, but also when something's off. And then you try to base on a video what type of atypical development you see. And you learn that in the tutorials a lot. Now, they asked me to tell a bit more about myself and the way I had experienced this specialization. And I think what I really found unexpected of myself is that I was a student delegate in this year, and that I really liked. And I also think I can tell you more about the specialization because of it. So the student delegates, we call them the studentenfracties in Dutch. They are the students, it's a group, like a team of 5 or 6 people that organize drinks, organize events, and talk to the teacher based on the evaluation. And that's why I got to know the teachers from developmental psychology quite a bit. Have you ever had a personal talk with one of your lecturers? Could you raise your hand if you did? 2 maybes. Everyone else, not really. And I think it's really cool about developmental psychology that your lecturers are very approachable. They are really lovely people. You can imagine people working with kids are quite lovely from the start. And they really are. They are really soft. They have all worked in the field, so they know what they're talking about when they are talking about how to do therapy or what a certain atypical behavior looks like. But also it's really easy to ask them questions, to interact. And I would certainly advise, if you have time left over or feel like you might squeeze it in, to go for the role as a student delegate, because you get to interact with them even more and feel like you can improve the courses. So what have I learned in this specialization, and what can you expect to learn? I think you can expect to learn in your bachelor's to analyze a lot of case studies, and based on that, get a sense of what it feels like to do that in real life. At the end of the year, or year and a half in your case, I was certainly able to explain the normal course of development, but also to recognize a lot of abnormal behaviors in kids based on videos, but also whenever I saw kids in real life, then I noticed, oh, that's that type of behavior. Or they are, I think this is more internalizing or externalizing, or that really reminds me of ADHD. Stuff like that is really cool. And based on this specialization, I think you can already expect to know more about that. Also, you know a lot about which tests they use in the Netherlands at the end of the year, which for some of you that are internationally focused might not be of use. And I don't know exactly how they are trying to solve that for you guys. But I'm fairly certain that at the end, you both know how to recognize certain tests and when to use them, but also how to use certain tests, because we were able to do tests on each other that were normally supposed for kids. So that was quite fun. And as I already told you, there's one course where you learn the basic therapist skills. And I really like that course. It's a small one at the end, and I believe you still have one. So that's certainly a practically based course. And the thing that I missed is actually doing more of that, as I had to do a lot of practical stuff. And in the end, they kind of postponed that towards the master. And because they expect you to do a stage, an internship, and do all the practical stuff there with real kids in real life and not within the university context, really. So in the end, I think that's the only thing I missed within this specialization. Now, I was also asked to tell you more about what my future looks like. My future outlook is quite uncertain. Currently, I'm kind of in this position. I teach for students like you, and I also give a lot of trainings, mostly for students, but I'm not sure yet whether I want to stay in that context or go more towards business or return to the developmental side of things, because I still like to work with kids, but I'm not sure if I still want to be a therapist. And I do want to give you some advice already. As you have seen, I did 2 specializations, and in the end, I think I kind of regret doing not 2 masters instead of the one that I did, because I think the limit in your studies really doesn't exist, and you should benefit from this crazy time in life as much as possible. Enjoy your student life, even though it's Corona. I know it's harder now, but I'm sure that in a while, when you start your specialization, that will become a little bit easier. And then try not to limit yourself. If you are interested in both developmental psychology and the clinical psychology, think about whether you can do both. Try not to limit yourself based on what you should do. So that's my final advice. And based on this, I would like to leave the rest of the time for questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Lotte, for your talk. I think it was really helpful. Before people start asking questions in the chat, I guess I'll have a question myself. So we did developmental psychology in first year, and we took a short class on it. How much do you think that relates? How much do you think that is a reasonable like introduction to then the specialization in developmental psychology?
I think it's just, as you said, a good introduction. But luckily, I hated that developmental course because it was so many theories and you had to read 2 books and it seemed like only theory. And I really expected to like that course because I wanted to do it later on. And luckily, I think the specialization is way nicer in its setup and what you learn. So if you already liked developmental psychology based on that one course in the first year, you're in for a treat.
And we have a question from Caroline. What was your least favorite course during the specialization?
Yeah, I still remember it was the one about normal development. So I think it's the very first one, because actually I think what probably everyone is interested in, but correct me if I'm wrong, is what does atypical behavior look like? And how can I treat it? How can I help someone with atypical behavior? So learning about how precisely when people develop what in a normal type of development, I found it quite boring because I felt like that was quite repetitive based on the course that you did in your first year. And you already see people around you developing more or less normally. So that felt like the least interesting one to me.
Thank you. And a question from Teresa saying, do you think that clinical and developmental psychology complement each other better than developmental and another specialization, so social or brain and cognition? Since you did 2.
Yeah, it was certainly a weird combo. I was the only one doing brain and cognition and clinical development, but I also think it sets you aside from a whole bunch of people doing the one specialization. So I think to answer the question, I find it a very interesting one. And for me, I'd say clinical and clinical development would be a very nice combo because they look alike. You learn the same and similar information, so you can integrate it a lot. However, when you combine it with social or brain and cognition, that makes you very unique. Mm-hmm. And in the clinical developmental field, I'd say whenever you combine it with brain and cognition, you are setting you aside from a whole bunch of people applying to a job that know certain skills, and you actually know more than those skills because you also know how that works in the brain. So that's quite cool. And I'm sure that you can say the same about social.
Okay. And now from Tess, do you only have exams every 8 weeks? You mentioned that they're scheduled at the end of the course. So what's the assessment process, I guess, of the course?
Very good question. Let's return to that slide as well, maybe. So 8 weeks, yeah. So most of the courses were 8 weeks, as I see, although some of them were shorter. But the thing with clinical developmental psychology, back in the day at least, was that they don't do interims that much. So you have one big one at the end.
Okay. And a question from Natalie. Can you talk more about internships that you've done and how important you feel that participating in an internship is during your bachelor's?
That's a very good question. And the thing is that I didn't do the master's of clinical developmental psychology. So I didn't do the internship within this field. My internship was doing teaching in a course in the second year about learning therapist skills or communication skills. Some of you may have had it already. And that was my internship. So I still stayed in the UVA context. So I think talking about internships is a very good plan for knowing more about this specialization, but the next speaker might know more about that.
Okay, thank you. And from Viraj, how did doing 2 specializations affect your thesis and writing your thesis?
I actually love that because in the end, I had to write my thesis in my 3rd year, which was brain and cognition, but then I already combined it with a specialization that I was about to do. So I really loved getting into a topic that I didn't know yet that well, and combining 2 fields that I really like, because I love knowing about development and especially atypical development. And I love finding out how the brain works. So it was a great combination.
Okay. And another one from Teresa. Why do you think that you would not want to work in therapy with children in the future?
Yeah, I was afraid this might be the question actually, because I'm not sure if I don't want that. And
okay.
Actually arose later than when I finished my master's. Now that I look back at what people in my specialization are doing currently, I think it's really cool what they do. And giving therapy is really improving someone else's life. And I think that's a great thing to do for the rest of your life, actually. So I might have my doubts about my decision back in the day.
Okay, and I guess the last question before our break, what advice would you tell yourself when you were studying, or I guess tell us students while studying and starting our specialization?
Very good question. So my advice, next to don't limit yourself, is really do as much on the side as you can, as your time schedule allows you. So in that year, in my clinical developmental year, I joined a new student association, even though I was already in one. I started as a student delegate, and that took quite a bit of my time. And doing all those things on the side next to my hobbies and my work, it really makes you strive for knowing what your passion is, and it keeps you motivated, I think. So whenever Miss Rona allows it, I'd say get most out of your student lives by going out and joining student associations or study associations where possible, and go out in general. But also do a lot of things on the side within psychology, because, for example, I only know this in Dutch, opleidingscommissie. Does anyone know what that's currently called? So
no,
sorry. I have honestly no idea. I'm sorry.
Okay, so there's a lot of teams that you can join as a student. So it can be the student delegate, but you can also improve education on a higher level in a team that I don't know the name of in English. And doing stuff like that also allows you to see more people that have already been in the field, namely the lecturers. And I think that really improves your sense of what you're going to do later, or what you can do later.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thank you so much, Lotte, for joining us today and for being here and giving us all this advice. I'm sure it has helped a lot of people get closer to making their decision.
No problem.
I think we will now have a 5-minute break. So until 6:05, and then we will be joined by our professional speaker.
Good luck with choosing, guys.
Yes, thank you.
And if anyone has any more questions, maybe for Lotte going forward, you can always, I think we have an email of hers, and we could always ask very kindly if if you could maybe send your questions to our email. If that's okay with Lotte, of course.
Certainly.
Perfect.
Most importantly, if Dr. Penelope is
I
here,
am.
so we can start. Yes, perfect.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for taking the time to spend this evening with us and talking to our students. So I guess we should start. Mia, if I could share my screen. Yes, I can. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So to start, if you could maybe introduce yourself professionally, what your current occupation is, as well as, I guess, your academic journey, a little bit about that.
Great. So I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me into this forum. It's a pleasure to join because it is a profession that I am very happy to be part of, and I rarely wake up in the morning and don't want to go to work. So I would say from that point of view that you have all chosen a career path which I think is rich in possibilities. I think one of the reasons why you might be struggling with what specialization to do is because there is quite a lot to choose from. And that's one of the richness of this professional area. But I would say, I would add to what Lotte was saying, that, be very active, be very open-minded. I would add that to what she was saying. And not feel that whatever you do right now, just as she was talking about her career path, that whatever you do sticks you somewhere and that you can't change again. And that again is a real value to this professional area. So Lotte spoke about certain bits of the course that she found boring. She already knew what was interesting and certain kind of basic psychology aspects. And I think that's true when you're training in any area and when you're learning in any area, that you want to get to the meaty bits, you want to get to the interesting bits. But I would caution there that you do stick to the basics. So there was one question there about psychological methods. I would advocate that you do actually give yourself a very firm grounding, because while that might seem dry, might seem basic, it does actually help you as you move forward in your journey through psychology to turn in different directions and to move into new specializations. So Noor, thank you for the question about my own journey. So I started my journey in psychology. I was an undergraduate in the early 80s, so back in the last century. And psychology has moved on quite a bit since then. There are new theories, new thinkings. And amongst the sciences, psychology is, strangely enough, one of the newest. You would think that couldn't be true because human beings must have been there before other disciplines developed. But actually, it is quite a relatively new discipline. It's only about a couple of 100 years old. But in that time, we have had an enormous impact on all sorts of areas, all sorts of other sciences. And I started my journey back in the 80s in social psychology, and I see that some of you are thinking of that specialization. And I think whatever you choose to do, as Lotte said, whatever you choose to do, remembering that quintessentially human beings are social people. We are part of a social network. We do not survive unless we have initially our families, a parent, somebody to feed us, but all through life, we may not feel that we're good team players, but we have to be part of a team. And just as we're seeing now in this current crisis, we cannot, it is our conjointness, it is the fact that we are social beings that has both spread the disease, helped us solve what we're about to do, but also made us feel very isolated when we can't join with others. So there's a value to learning about that of the social side for whatever branch of psychology that you want to go into. Having started in social psychology, I, like Lotte, was interested in the child and how the child was working. I was also interested in criminology. And because my degree was a science degree, psychology as a social science, we also did quite a lot of work in research methods. And I think, again, what has become very clear in the current COVID crisis is if you do not have good evidence, good information, good knowledge, if you don't know how to collect that knowledge and use that knowledge, then actually the knowledge is not very valuable. So I would concur very much with Lotte that whatever you do, make it a mix, be open-minded, and you will continue to learn. And I remind you of a quotation, sometimes attributed to Kant, sometimes to Marx, which is that theory without practice is empty. So get as much enjoyment and practice as you can. And practice without theory is blind. So remember that your studies are part of what will help you choose as you move forward. So I went into specializing in child development, even at my undergraduate level. And so I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to be flexible. And I wanted to pick, therefore, something in psychology that was translatable to different cultural contexts. So I went into educational psychology, but to do that at the time, you also had to teach. So whatever is the branch that you finally decide is of interest to you at this point in time, have a look at what that means in terms of how long it takes you to train, if you want to be flexible, you know, which countries require what kinds of registration, and just make a lot of inquiries about specific areas. And most of us in psychology do like what we do, and we'd be happy to talk to you. And so I talked to a few people. I was interested in clinical, and I was interested in educational. I was basically interested in working with children and families. And I went into educational because I found that it was actually easier to register in different parts of the world with an educational program behind you than with a clinical program, because there we get into people's misunderstanding of the difference between psychiatry and psychology. So for those of you, and that's most of you who are currently interested in clinical, as you think about that, also I think you need to think about how you describe yourself, because people will confuse you. People will think you're a psychiatrist. What is the difference? And you need to be clear yourself what the difference is, what you are and what you aren't. And for me, I think fundamentally, the difference is that psychologists are about behavior change, whereas psychiatrists are about behavior management and behavior modification, even more so. And I think that's what we as psychologists bring to the discussion, which psychiatrists can't, which is an open-mindedness about what is normal. So I would still advocate that learning about what is normal is really important as a clinical psychologist, because how can you help somebody pick for themselves and choose for themselves unless there's a joint conversation about what it is that they want to be, what's the normal that they want to reach. Before I go down that road too much. So personally, I was still interested in therapy and therapeutic systems at the time. So I chose to study my educational psychology. Although that slide says that it came from Brunel, I was actually at the Tavistock Clinic, which is a psychodynamic institution. And that's the other bit about my journey. I deliberately chose to move from one area to another because I wanted to experience as broad an experience as I could. And like Lotte was saying, all through this time, I would volunteer in different places. I would work in different places. I worked in a social group for mentally handicapped, well, that's what we called it at the time, adults with severe learning difficulties. I worked in hospitals. I worked in play groups. Sometimes I got paid. But at this point in time, you may be worried about doing internships because we're being constrained about where we can go and what we can do. But don't worry about that, because again, you've chosen a fantastic discipline. We can learn about other people in so many ways. We can learn about other people through art, through books, through drama, through films. So if you try and be broad about what you read, yes, read the academic journals, read psychology books, but watch films, read novels. The artists and creative people, they talk to their souls. And what we are doing as psychologists is we're learning about behavior. We're learning about what people think through their behavior. And if people are expressing themselves in novels, we can get an insight into different ideas too. So if you feel frustrated at times that you can't follow up on certain internships or certain programs or volunteer as you might have done, this time last year, you can still keep learning about human beings, even just with you in a book. So from educational psychology, at the time that meant teaching, and I was not in a hurry. And I think when you're at your end of life in your 20s, you kind of think, oh, if I don't get on, I'm going to have big debts. I'm not going to, be able to make choices. But that's another beauty about psychology, is that you can work and learn at the same time. So even though I was teaching, and that isn't what I particularly wanted to do, and I felt constrained at one level that I had to teach in order to be able to do that master's program, I still carried on learning. I still learned a great deal. So any job that you are able to move into, it is part of your journey as a psychologist to broaden your mind, to learn new things. And you can always go back to different specializations. So it wasn't until I had had my children that I actually did my PhD. And whilst that's not necessarily the most common way about it, there was still also a number of people of the same age as myself when I did that. And so my PhD was looking at a crossover between assessment, which was something I picked up from my educational training, and health. and it was working at a malaria research unit, which might seem an odd place for a psychologist to end up, on the coast of Kenya. Beautiful place to end up. But so what's a psychologist doing in a malaria research unit? And then this again is a really wonderful thing about psychology, because you are valuable and useful to everybody in every conversation that involves human beings. And frankly, name me something that happens in this world that somehow doesn't involve human beings. So I then kind of drifted in through that to sort of health psychology, because what we were looking at was the impact of malaria on children's development. And that brought me in, strangely enough, kind of to complete a cycle. I told you I started in social, moved into education, then through health and through public health, I've come back full circle into social psychology. And what I do now is I work with a team who support organizations implementing programs in the early childhood space around the world. So we have teams from South America through Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And there are multiple disciplines involved in such programs. So they're trying to make a difference in that early childhood space. There are some parenting programs, there are programs based in hospitals, there are programs in schools, there are programs in refugee camps, and you can see the multiple talents and the multiple skills that you would need to work in all those spaces. So what do I do for them? Well, because I have a background in therapy, in education, in health, I can think through with them what they're doing and what might be an effective way to do it. Because I have a background in research, I can help them think through their psychological methods. How are they monitoring what they're doing? How are they learning from what they're doing? But I also, because they're the experts in their field, I learn a great deal from talking to each of these teams about how they engage with communities, how they build up their financial sustainability. So you can see I've also kind of moved into organizational work. And from listening to one group, I then pass on the wisdom of that group to another group. So I have a really great, amazing job. I spend about 2 or 3 hours of every day talking to people all the way around the world. And hopefully I add to the richness of their thinking. But I certainly continue to learn a great deal about human behavior and what we need. So I would start where I finished in this little journey and say to you, I think you've chosen a really cool area to work in. Welcome to it. Stick at it. Be as broad-minded as you can, and go with your interest areas, because obviously if you are interested in something, you will really dig into it and you will really both have something to offer it and gain from it.
Thank you so much for this introduction that you gave. You've mentioned that you worked in social and developmental, organizational, and all these different fields of psychology. What would you say would be both in terms of for yourself and professionally, the skill that has proved most useful throughout all of those fields, or just the field of developmental or just social, organizational? A skill that you would say would be crucial for someone to have working into developmental psychology?
I don't really want to be pushed into just picking one. I have, as Lotte was speaking, I wrote down there a few words that actually will answer that question. I think central to everything are listening skills. Whatever field you move in, whether it's business, whether it's schools, whether it's families, organizations, we as a psychologist really, one of my tutors said that the job she feels she is closest to doing is that of being a plumber. People come to you because they have a blockage, because they're stuck with something, and they look to you to clear that blockage. And our ultimate tool is to listen, because we're not always going to be there, whether we're a clinician or an organizational guru. We're not always going to be there, but if we can empower our client group, our collaborators, with the ability to listen to themselves through us listening to them, then they will learn also not to need us. And essentially that is our role as a psychologist, to work ourselves out of a job. But luckily we never do, because somebody always finds yet another problem to come up with. So if you push me to, I think it's listening skills, but I linked to that is also the ability to do critical thinking. And whatever you read, whatever you see, whatever you hear, if you have developed the ability to stand back and look into it and assess it, and not exactly judge, but be critical about what you see, ask yourself questions, ask other people questions, then we start to understand what it is that's happening. And I think the third thing is never make assumptions. Have your hypothesis, have your ideas, but don't make an assumption of what it is that you will see or not see, and use your critical thinking and your listening skills to come to some suggestions about ways forward.
Okay. And from these skills, I guess, talking more about the transition from education to work, for you personally, what would you say, I guess, was your biggest challenge in facing this transition from studying into the professional field?
Well, I've been very lucky because I've never had to quite do that. I've spread out my courses over time, but because of having been in research for quite a number of years, I'm a perpetual student. You're always learning, you're always reading new material. And I think if it is a field that, as I said at the beginning, it's quite a new science, and it has been changing a lot. And we have contributed as psychologists to the development of all sorts of mathematical procedures, statistical procedures. So how does that come about? It comes about because essentially we do our reading, we do our discussing with each other. So in a sense, I mean, I still read today, I still study today, and I'm coming up for retirement, and I don't intend to stop.
Right. And now you've done, your CV is extremely extensive, and you've done a lot of institutional work. And I guess the question is, what extra, for a student here, what extracurricular activities would you advise someone to participate in, whether that be in, as we've talked about, internships, or if you advise to go into institutional work, or more, what field, what area would you advise us to take extracurriculars, or even, I guess, a job within developmental?
Well, if you guys were planning to be dentists and I suggested to you take anything, it would be a little bit hard to know the relevance of that to being a good dentist. But that, again, is the value of studying psychology, because what you're doing is looking at human behavior and at behavior change, and that happens everywhere. So if you take any job, it's relevant. Human human resources is relevant. You're dealing directly with how people work in certain areas. So whatever comes your way as an opportunity, I would take it. I can see one of the questions there is, how did you find volunteer opportunities? I mean, I just sometimes walked into places and said, oh, this is neat, can I help out? I looked online. I looked in the newspapers. I would look in. I would just take an opportunity that came my way, and the benefit of doing it as a volunteer rather than waiting to be paid can be that since they're not paying you, they don't own you, and if you're not enjoying it, you can give it. You can say, well, I've learned as much as I can from here, and you can go somewhere else. And when you find something that really is of interest to you and captures your attention, then try and turn that into much more of a paid internship if you can, or keep at it. But for me, I think it is that thing about being flexible and being broad-minded and thinking anything we do helps us understand how people, as they say, tick.
Perfect. And so in terms of demand in work, having worked so much in the field, in terms of having students come out of the field of developmental and say we just graduated our bachelor's in specialization, how much demand in the professional sector would you say there is for a bachelor's student, or do you recommend a path of continuing to study before finding a job, or what would be like the path for a student finishing the specialization to take into the professional sector?
Well, when I studied, education was free, and we didn't have to leave with the worry about paying off a student loan, not at the bachelor level. So you could take your time and try something out before you went along to do a master's. It gave you time to save up some money to do that. And like I say, you're working with humans, everything is useful. And I have found along my journey, people who came in after working even to do their bachelor's added so much to the discussion. So I'm not saying that as a young person you have nothing to add to the field. For sure you do. But I would say that you don't need to be in a rush. Right now you have to choose your specialization. And I could say to you, well, these are the areas where there are gaps now. But by the time you've graduated and by the time you've maybe done your master's, the world changes some. So I'm not sure that my prediction would be any more accurate than your gut instinct about what you actually want to do and what you find interesting. I would say, though, it's very clear that if you work with children, unless you work in neuropsychology, you tend to earn less. So if money is an object for you, anything that's associated with women does still get paid less. So we, I think, need you, younger generation, to make sure that that stops happening and that anything that you choose to do, whether you're a man or a woman, gets paid the same. But back to your question, remind me what we were supposed to answer.
Of course, I guess the demand for students into the professional sector of development psychology.
Yeah, I think the world has gone through phases where you could get any job you wanted with a bachelor's, and then people started to see, oh well, you need a master's. And then it was certainly in academics that you couldn't even get a job unless you had a PhD. But I think I think it's turned back a bit now, and people realize that experience is actually as valuable, if not as valuable, as, if not more valuable than qualifications. But I mean, even in business, a lot of people have masters and find it hard to get jobs without it. So I guess it at the end of the day, it comes back also to networking, and that's where volunteering and doing internships really count, because then you meet people meet you, and they know what you can do. And you know, it's much easier these days than last century to do part-time programs too. So if you had the energy, and you go and get a job off, and you're lucky to get a job after your bachelor's, because don't worry about not knowing what to do next, because you can always go back and do that.
Perfect. I guess now we can turn to the chat and answer some questions that the rest of the people have been asking you. So we have one from Teresa saying, what do you find to be the most fascinating part? What is the most challenging part of working with children?
Fascinating, I think, is the word. I really enjoy the company of children, because they don't make assumptions either, and you can have some very interesting conversations and some very real experiences working with children. And as the consequence of being fascinated by that, I don't necessarily find it challenging. I think the challenging bit are the parents, or the teachers, or the adults that are in charge of them, of making the decisions for those children. And the reason why it's challenging is because they need a lot more persuasion to open up, and to break down their defenses, and talk genuinely about the reason why they're there. And I would say, as a consequence, I think I got a little bit fed up thinking, I am in this business for working with children, but I don't see them. I just see their parents and their teachers. And then when you embrace that, and when you realize that you are all in it together, and you actually realize that your job is to help them fix it, and not be the plumber directly. It comes back to the social aspect. And now you've made me think of another skill that you need: patience. Because you are waiting for somebody else to realize that they can fix it.
Perfect. And from Sol, she's interested in working with young people, and especially children with autism. Do you think that a developmental degree is enough, or would you recommend a master's, a postgraduate in that area? And how focused can a postgraduate be into a specific area like autism disorder?
I see that there's a great fascination with autism, and I don't want to sound cynical or jaded, because my first job once I had graduated from my bachelor's, my first job was actually in autism research. I went in as a very junior scientist. I spent as much time photocopying things for the senior scientists as doing anything else. But what I did learn from that experience is that there are multiple issues that face people who get labeled with whatever is their label. And the biggest challenge they face is to get a life around and outside of that label. And at the time that I was working in that field, the big thing that everybody was talking about was dyslexia. And that was the big challenge. Everybody wanted to work in dyslexia. That was the hot topic. And I don't know why people don't think that's so cool anymore. But I still think that all these things challenge us, because we're sticking people into boxes with labels we've made up. And at the end of the day, I think whatever we want to work in, we have to realize that these are real human beings. And whatever sort of system of thinking we develop about how we can change that situation for them, again, I think it comes back to humility and patience on our part. Back to the question, though, about how to do that training, again, that quotation, it's a mixture of both things. And the order that you do it in, it kind of depends on chance to a degree. So theory without practice is empty, and practice without theory is blind. You need to do both, and you need to do both consistently. Even when you have developed a specialization, the theory will change and your practice will feed into that thinking. So it is about finding a balance between actually doing things, which I think is something that Lotte was talking about too. Actually working with real people, but not just working with real people, really doing your reading around your topic area as well.
And we have a question from Zen that related back to one of your challenges that you mentioned. How do you balance between catering to parents and teachers' preconceived notions in order to help children who are not able to ask for help themselves? How do you use this line, I guess, and be able to mediate between the two?
The secret is not to tell people, but to ask. And if you can learn to listen and to ask critical questions that are not, which they do not take as being judgmental or in any way shaming or damning, if you can ask people questions and encourage them to answer their own questions, I think that is the key skill of a good psychologist. Whether you're in a clinical practice or whether you're working in a business or in an organization, it always comes back to turning it around. People are asking you for the answers, but actually the answers lie within themselves. And if you can dig that out through your listening skills and through the questioning the questioning line that you use, they will be forever coming back and thanking you.
Okay. And going back to networking also, what would your advice be for us in succeeding in networking in the field of developmental psychology?
Well, part of it is it possible for you to do internships? You know, part of it is to link up with people in the field who are working in there. And don't be shy about asking people. They can always say no. And somebody will eventually say yes. So in my journey through my career, I have at different times reached out to different people nervously, at total strangers at times, but some of those total strangers have become some of my closest friends through working with them and doing their photocopying. So I think I'm nervously suggesting that now because we're in a very strange point in time and you can't walk into people's offices or into clinical settings so easily right now. But I'm sure you guys will come up with a creative way of linking up with people. And I know that if your specialization that you're interested in is clinical psychology, I think you need to turn to other clinical psychologists who are now working largely online and asking them if there's a way that you can learn along with them or that you can help them in some way in their work. And as people settle into whatever it is that we have in store for us over the next 2 years, I think you will, if you persist, you will find a way of learning by being part of a team. So I guess that really is the question. Find yourself a team that will have you, even if it's a team of one, and see how it goes, and then teach the rest of us how you can do that in this strange world we now inhabit.
One more question from Maria, saying, in order to become a therapist and work with children, is a specialization in developmental psychology necessary? Or can, if, for example, if you specialize in another field, such as clinical, can we then work with children still in that field?
So, I mean, this varies by country. So you need to look at the country that you intend to live in, or you intend to live in next, as to what the regulations are for working directly with children. If you work in educational psychology, you tend to end up working more with the adults and less with the children. If you work in clinical psychology, you might spend more time with children, but you still have to manage the families around them, because if their context doesn't change, then nothing is going to change for them. But what you're allowed to do and who you're allowed to do it with and how much training you need for that really depends on each country. But as a proper clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist, the training is as long as it takes really to become a GP. So you need to think about that too. A general practitioner. So, you know, doctors think they have the longest training, but they don't. And I think you need to really dig into the specifics of the country that you work in for what you're allowed to do. In some countries, you can do, say, a counselling course, which is much shorter, and the bulk of work with children is done through counsellors. But I think whatever you choose to do moving forward, bear in mind your own well-being. And psychiatry has one of the highest rates of mental ill health of any profession. And I think one of the reasons why psychologists don't burn out so quickly, don't become alcoholics so readily as psychiatrists, is that we tend to work in teams and we tend to work with each other. And in many countries, as a psychologist, you only get your registration if you show that you are having peer support and peer counselling and along the way. And I think that is a very good lesson to remember, that if you go into the field of abnormal psychology or working with people with quite extreme problems, you need to guard and protect yourself. And the best way to do that is to be part of the team and to share and learn as you go with your team.
Okay, thank you so much. And I guess to wrap up, what would you be, I guess, your final advice for us as students, as future professionals?
Well, I would just say, stick at it. It is such a rich discipline. You've done well to pick it. Stay in it and find your niche. So there are all different ways that you can apply the skills you're learning right now that fit your personality, fit your dreams and your aspirations, and don't give up. Thanks very much for having me, and enjoy, everybody. Noah, you've gone quiet. You seem happy, but I don't know what you're happy about.
second. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Now I can't,
No?
but now I can.
Okay, perfect. So I just want to thank you once again, and thank you for joining us. And if anyone else has any more questions about the specializations or about O20, feel free to message us and ask us about anything. And yeah, thank you once again.
Thank you for letting me join you. Bye.
Bye.